for it.
Racism has impacted most of my life as an African American, particularly in the U.S. When I think about racism, I think about the understanding that when you see me, you only see me, my physical development, my color. When we only see a person's color, we really don't see the person. And we then begin to make assumptions about who or what this person may be or what they may be like. I found in my life as an African American, race has been a significant part of our history. As many of you know, or you've come to understand, that many Africans came to this country as slaves, although not everyone. And with that mindset, many have perceived my role and have continued to see my role in my relationship to this community, to this country, through the eyes of slavery. And even there is a lack of, again, understanding about who I really am and who I have become. And so as I have taken on this journey of living my life as an African American, under the guise of being an African, of black race, there are many narratives that has continued to shape how I see myself and how I see others. I think of my life growing up, but also I think of my life as I became a professional, became a part of a larger community. And I think about race. As a child growing up, I had the unique, I would say, opportunity or experience of growing up in the segregated South. In the segregated South, race was a big issue. As you know, Jim Crow laws were in effect in the 60s, and segregation was a very strong paradigm in our community. And particularly, I lived in what we call the Southern Belt, Memphis, Tennessee, which has a great history, again, of some of the struggles, as well as Mississippi, is where my parents and grandparents were born. And so, as a young child, I remember those experiences of going to being in the South, where I could not go to certain places, I couldn't eat in certain spaces, I couldn't be among white people at certain times. And so my whole life was just navigating this notion of being black versus being white. And for me, I had very little knowledge of any other groups at that time other than blacks and white, because the fountain said for whites, and then it said for either color, which again referred to us as blacks or African Americans. And so I spent those early years, the first probably 10 years of my life, navigating the cultural narrative of race and racism. I can share with you many stories of where either myself directly or my parents or my grandparents were constantly put on trial because of our race or not being in our space according to the laws of that time, which was, again, Jim Crow and segregation. Probably my most vivid stories was as we would travel between Memphis and Mississippi, which again, normally about 40 miles, when we would want to stop at certain places or a gas station to get gas or to maybe go to the bathroom, we could only stop at certain places along the route. We couldn't go to certain gas stations. They distinctly let you know we do not serve colors here. Or if we went to one, it said if you want to have access to facilities, you may have to go in the back in order to be served in that instance. So I just became a part of, again, my youth development. When we would go, when we would visit our grandparents who were actually sharecroppers in Mississippi, Sharecroppers were those who lived on partial land, and they usually worked for a white boss that they would call. And so that relationship was always based on, kind of this tenuous thing that me having to know how to approach the white boss, as well as understanding my place in this unique community, or in this case on our family farm. It was much different than what it was when I went back to Memphis. And so I was very conscious that when I went to stay or visit my grandparents, it was going to be a little different culture and atmosphere. When we approached many of the whites, we had to say yes sir, no sir, and we had to make sure that we did whatever they said, because if not, it could bring some type of reflection on the family, or even some cases harm, if you didn't do things properly. So this idea of being identified by my race was very, very much a part of my early childhood development. Like I said, when we would go to various establishments, various places, we had to be conscious of certain spaces and certain places were just for blacks or were just for white. My elementary school was all black. We could not go to any white high schools. We didn't have white students in our schools at all. Our churches, as you know, was predominantly were all black. So it was that very sense, again, not really being a part of the larger community, but only having to stay within our own community. So that was a big eye-opening in terms of racism. As we made a migration, when I was about 10, my mother decided to move the family to California. Whole different cultural narrative, going from the segregated South to what we would call the open West. There's this kind of notion about how everything was open in the West and you were free to be when you were on the West Coast. But that was an interesting transition. I can remember very, very candidly my development of coming from the South and now being on the West Coast. First of all, California, as you know, geographically was much different than the South. Palm trees, beaches, sunshine all day, every day. It was a whole new awakening in terms of me culturally. As well as, again, understanding the culture of California. It was a much different culture than the segregated South. There was the liberty of being able to approach someone from a different ethnic group with not necessarily the same protocol. It was there I actually got a chance to, my first encounter with what we call the Latino community. Largely Latino, Asian. I had not been among them as a child, but this was a whole new cultural perspective for me to be there. Also language. I spoke with a Southern drawl. It's like, you all, how y'all doing? I quickly learned that that was not the language of the West Coast. I had to now learn how to speak a little more properly, as they would remind me. I was oftentimes teased. They would want to know how do I say certain words. And when I'm talking in the classroom there, and someone would say, how do you say that? I said, Memphis, Tennessee. And so they would tease me because, again, my Southern drawl. But again, I became conscious of that, and so I made it a point to try to learn how to speak more West Coast-like, more proper in how some would say. But again, we still had the cultural, I would say, mandate of being recognized as being black as opposed to being white, because this was a time of the civil rights movement as well. So I was experiencing this notion of, again, why is it that we had to now protest to have what many were calling our rights as an American citizen. I became more conscious of Dr. King and the civil rights marches, the sit-ins, which were mainly at that time happening in the South, where I had just came from. But I was very conscious, again, the struggle for blacks to be a part of what we would call the mainstream of America was a real challenge to the African American community. And so these conversations about our place, our rights, became very vivid in my mind. In addition to when we moved there, we moved into an area where again was predominantly black. We eventually, our initial time being there, we was in a small, very small house, which made about 2 bedrooms, and we had about 7 of us living in this 2-bedroom house. But we eventually moved into the government housing, which gave us the space, rooms, bedrooms, living rooms, kitchen, all separate. And that became a big part of, again, us kind of moving into a better lifestyle. But the cultural narrative was very strong during this part of the 60s. I had just moved to Watts, California, which that summer they had the riots. We moved there that fall. So I came into, again, this period of civil unrest, but it had settled there in Watts. But still, the after effects were still going on. And so by that I meant there was the rise of the Black Panther Party. They had started coming to the community, reminding of us, again, our sense of right as blacks in America and what that looked like and what that meant and what it was going to take for us to have those rights. As some would have understood down there, their approach was a little different than Dr. Martin Luther King. A little more radical, as they might say, a little more militant, but very much they demanded that we have those rights that were guaranteed to us in our Constitution. So I was aware of this conversation along the line, again, of race. Growing up there in South Central, again, became a very pivotal point for me to start to learning how to navigate. Having these conversations on a regular basis about who I was as an African American. There was other groups, House of Uhuru, which was another pro-black group, and several others that were constantly reminding us who we really are and what our rights were as a people. And so I became conscious of that, through that, even in the music that was being shared back then. It was a period of what we would call the soul music. Some may remember the Temptations, the Supremes, Motown, all the artists, Stevie Wonder, James Brown, Bobby Bublé. These became a major social narrative in my life as an African American. And it was through their music, then that I was reminded of who I was and what I could be, because they represented our hopes and they represented much of our dreams. And they gave us the language of what it meant to be black and beautiful. Some of you remember those slogans, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. Those were my narratives that I was learning as a young African American. And so I began to embrace those ideas. I've shared with some in the past, it was about the time of my junior high years that I started to recognize that if I was going to really make a difference in changing the social narrative of what it meant to be black in America, I would have to have a greater understanding of who I was and what I needed to do to become that. So James Brown and others, mentors and artists would let them know without an education, you might as well be dead. And so I began to really embrace the idea that if I was going to be somebody as an African American in America, I needed to make sure that I was properly educated. So I made a covenant with myself in the 7th grade that I was going to become a good student. Because up to this time, I had gone to about 7 different elementary schools before I actually reached the 5th grade. And so as you can see, life was very unstable. But yet, I knew that in many ways that I needed to be a lot more informed, particularly as a student. And so I made a point to myself that I was not just going to go there and just try to get by, but I wanted to become a good student. And so it was during that time I started getting involved with some of the student activities. I was a pretty good athlete even back then. In fact, my ability to run became my ticket to social acceptance. You know how it is when you're growing up with your peers. They want to see how good you are and what you can really do. And so I was proven to be one of the fastest guys in the neighborhood. And so that gave me props with my friends. And so they said, yeah, you can come on, you can hang with us, you're fast. And so I was able to gain some respect in the neighborhood because of that. But again, being conscious of that idea, again, trying to fit in the community, being aware of, again, the sense of what it meant to be black, the vocabulary that I would have to develop, again, it was also during that time the idea of the black brotherhood became very popular. And we saw each other as brothers and sisters. You may remember those times. What's up, brother? What's up, sister? That became a whole new narrative language for me, again, about my sense of identity, and particularly as a person of color. So with that understanding, I began to pursue, again, this notion of how I could become a well-informed black person. I took my academics very seriously. I ran for student, got involved with student government. Again, you're talking to a gentleman who was not very verbal. I was not a verbal person. I was very quiet, but I was eager. I was always eager to learn. And I've gotten involved in a few different activities in addition to sports. Got involved with arts. I had some passion with art. I also had some passion with music. But again, just trying to figure all those things out during those early years of elementary and junior high. So during the junior high years, I really kind of found myself being a student, and I did well, about an A-B student. When we matriculated from junior high to high school. And it was really there in high school that I really became that student and that involved and engaged. I got involved again in student government. I learned how to play chess. As an African American, yes, we were learning how to play chess even back then. But I thought, again, it was something that was important to helping me to define who I could be, or how people would perceive me. And I got involved with some chess tournaments even. So I wasn't just satisfied with being a good athlete. Sports, again, was a passion, but also a great vehicle for me to show my skills, my abilities. And I went on to become one of the top track and field individuals at the high school. I set a couple school records in track and field. I was on the 4x1 relay team. Won the conference my senior year. I also became one of the top sprint hurdlers in the conference, set a record in the 70-yard highs. So I was motivated